Chronicles of the War of Souls book series. Book 1 Valeria, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 15. Khazad Gatol, The Oath Upon the Ruins. The column stretched for miles. A living entity transformed into a slow, but inexorable serpent of steel, crawling along the paths of the great tunnel that once, in an age of glory, bound the two great strongholds of the Dwarven people into a single kingdom. The air here was different, not warm and living, smelling of food and hearth smoke, as in the inhabited halls of Noruz Damarak, but cold, still, dead, and thick with the scent of age-old dust. The tunnel vaults, once raised with the greatest skill and pride, were now in many places scarred with cracks as deep as wounds, in some spots choked by ancient, fungus-grown cave-ins. Upon the walls, beneath layers of soot and saline deposits, half-eroded but still legible runic inscriptions told of glorious campaigns and great kings from the era of Khazad Gatol. The dwarves marched in near total silence, their gazes sliding over these mute, sorrowful testaments to past grandeur, and in their stern faces one could read not only iron resolve but also a shadow of deep, personal, almost physical grief for a lost golden age. They walked, literally treading upon the bones of their own dead history, and every step echoed in their hearts with the resonance of long-faded glory and retribution yet to come. The elves moved with their inherent noiseless, almost airy grace, but even their usually unruffled faces, smooth as the surface of a forest lake, were tense, their brows slightly furrowed, their keen, sensitive senses perceived in this dead air not merely oblivion and natural decay, but something far more monstrous, a living, pulsating echo of a great defilement that had desecrated the very soul of these halls, perverting their original essence. Lyra walked without bowing her head, her fingers with their slender, sharp nails convulsively tightening around the hilt of the ritual dagger at her belt. From time to time, she felt the same pain as the dwarves, but perceived it differently, not as a personal loss, but as a jarring, ear-rending dissonance in the great, eternal symphony of the world, which her people had always heard from the very first day. Daryl's rangers, these children of two worlds, proved utterly indispensable here, on the very border of light and subterranean gloom. Their sharp eyes, accustomed to twilight, and hearing as keen as a night predator's, caught what inevitably eluded the dwarves, focused on the main path, the faintest stirring of stagnant air inside tunnels choked with rubble, the barely audible, teeth-grinding scrape of stone on stone that could mean a hidden ambush or a falling trap. They were living shadows against the bright backdrop of dwarven steel and bulky armor, their short, sharp commands, delivered by whistle or gesture, snapping like a whip, helping the enormous, cumbersome column avoid the most dangerous, crumbling sections in time. The Centaurs in these cramped stone corridors were like a living, breathing fortress, moving slowly and majestically along a narrow channel. Their powerful, muscular torsos and heavy, steel-shod hooves seemed at first glance awkward and cumbersome in these low passages, but their raw, primal strength became another invisible shield for the entire host. Vrondar walked in the center of his small but tight-knit band, gazing ahead into the thick darkness as if he already saw before him not the dark granite walls, but the boundless, scorched steppes poisoned by the same relentless enemy, now hiding within the stone heart of the mountains. And in the very first ranks, carrying in their hearts an unquenchable fury for burned homes and ravaged families, walked a grim guard and Mercil. They were the hardened tip of a great spear, its cutting edge. Each of their steps, measure and heavy, was a silent challenge to the silence. Each breath, whistling through clenched teeth a new oath of vengeance. They did not look back at the kindred and allies marching behind. Their gazes, full of somber fire, were fixed upon the impenetrable darkness ahead, from which there now began to drift a faint but relentlessly growing scent, the choking reek of goblin cook fires, the sweetish stench of rot, and something else, bitter and metallic, that cut the nostrils like a blade and foretold blood. Bread Stoneheart walked among them, neither hastening nor slowing his deliberate, measured pace, akin to the movement of the earth itself. His silent presence was the fixed point, the unshakable axis around which this vast, motley, seething army pulsed and revolved. He issued no loud orders, gave no encouragement. He simply walked, and the stone beneath his forged boots seemed more solid and reliable, while the clinging shadows in the corners appeared less deep and hostile. Sometimes he would pause for a moment, touching the rough wall surface with his palm, and then the keenest of the elves and rangers would feel a slight, barely perceptible vibration underfoot, as if the ancient mountain, rousing from slumber, was passing its messages and warnings to him. To journey full of hardship and tense anticipation, took several long weeks. With each passing hour, each turn of the tunnel, the air grew heavier, denser, more saturated with an alien and overtly hostile presence that weighed upon the mind. Then, one evening, when the column halted for a brief rest in a colossal, desolate hall whose vaults were lost in an impenetrable subterranean height, the scouts returned with news. They spoke no words. Their faces, beneath layers of road grime and sweat, were more eloquent than any report. They merely pointed in silent unison, with identical grim expressions, at the gaping black maw of the western passage. But everyone already understood, already felt it on their skin. The draft emanating from there, cold and unpleasant, carried that same, now familiar and hated stench, but now tenfold stronger, and with it a barely audible, but distinct resonance, like the distant roar of surf, yet composed of thousands of rasping voices, the clang of weapons, the grating of wagons, and a strange, ominous rhythmic pounding that froze the blood in one's veins. They stood upon the threshold. Khazad Gatol, their goal and their curse, awaited ahead. Beyond this final darkness, the silence that fell over the camp after this was not peaceful, but ringing, stretched to the limit, like 1,000 bowstrings before a volley. The dwarves froze in the poses in which the news had caught them, gripping the hilts of axes and hammers so tightly their knuckles turned white. Their gazes, full of grim, almost religious resolve, were fixed upon the gaping blackness of the western passage, as if trying to pierce it with the force of their hatred. In that polyphonic roar they heard not merely the noise of a vast enemy camp. They heard sacrilegious laughter defiling the visages of ancestors on bas-reliefs, the scraping of claws upon the marble of sarcophagi, where the undecaying ashes of their great kings rested. Lyral stood motionless as a statue, her face pale as moonlight and detached, her gaze turned inward. Through the accustomed, clear magical fabric of the world, she perceived here only a solid, visceral, mindless hatred emanating from the tunnel like a thick, black river. Daryl's rangers, obeying an unseen signal, dispersed like ghosts along the perimeter of the vast hall, their gray cloaks and hoods merging with the stone outcrops and deep cracks as naturally as if they were part of this ancient, silent masonry. They, with their heightened senses, were the first to feel the barely perceptible, earthquake-like tremor underfoot, to catch a suspicious, worm-like squirming in the darkest, dampest crevices. Bread Stoneheart slowly rose from his stone. He uttered not a single word, made no loud gesture. He merely swept the hall with his heavy, implacable gaze, gliding over the frozen, breath-held warriors, and this silent command was enough. Everyone, from the white-haired elder to the young squire, understood. The time for words and doubts was irrevocably past. Ahead lay only steel, fury, and the will to win. The frozen silence absorbed the ragged, stifled breathing of hundreds of warriors, the nervous flicker of torch flames casting dancing shadows upon the walls, and the oppressive, almost tangible weight of anticipation for the inevitable. The air, cold and stale, smelling now not only of age-old stone dust, alien odors, and acrid smoke, seemed to thicken to the consistency of murky jelly, making it hard to breathe. Lyral, standing shoulder to shoulder with the silent breath, felt every nerve in her body drawn taut as a bowstring, ready to snap at any moment. Her elven hearing, immeasurably keener than the dwarves, plucked individual, distinct notes from the distant but clear were emanating from the black maw of the western passage. A shrill, inarticulate babble, dried, cawing mutters, the grating of dulled iron on stone, and a revolting, scale-like rustle that promised no good. Daryl stood motionless, his predatory gaze boring into the thick, almost liquid darkness swirling in the far corners of the hall, behind the stone columns. His vertical pupils narrowed to thin, soot-black lines, absorbing every gleam of light, every scrap of moving shadow, every hint of danger. Slowly, almost imperceptibly to an outsider's eye, he raised a fist clenched tight and his rangers seemed to dissolve along the walls, their silhouettes merging with the irregularities of stone outcrops and deep cracks so naturally and soundlessly they might have been part of the ancient, much-seen masonry itself. There was no click of a sole on stone, no jingle of steel on a buckle, only a faint, sigh-like rustle of coarse cloak fabric, barely discernible in the ringing silence. Braid and the rangers, with their senses stretched to the limit, were the first to sense the approaching doom. It was not a loud sound, but the faintest, barely perceptible vibration running through the stone floor, as if beneath the thin skin of the earth countless hordes of blind worms were stirring, ready to burst forth at any moment. And burst forth they did. Massive flagstones, beneath the feet of several dwarves from the vanguard, suddenly gave way with a dry crack, dragging the heavily armored warriors into black, gaping pits, from which there immediately rose, from below, short, choking screams and most smacking, revolting sounds that froze the blood even in the most seasoned dwarves. This was no simple, furious assault. It was a cunning, calculated trap, prepared in advance with cold, almost reptilian calculation. Simultaneously, from the very ceiling, like ripe, rotten fruit, hundreds of kobolds rained down, having lain motionless until then in the shadows of the colossal vaults. Their scaly, gray-brown skin blended perfectly with the stone's texture, and their glowing yellow, sulphurous eyes flashed in their fall like hellish sparks. From the cracks, all sides, came Daryl's voice, hoarse with strain and sharp as flint striking steel. Cutting through the rising chaos, the small, agile reptilian humanoids did not charge headlong into the close-knit steel wedges of the dwarves. They acted as a single, intelligent swarm, using their numbers and deep, instinctive knowledge of the deeps. They darted from the thickest gloom, delivered one swift, precise strike with claws sharp as poisoned needles, or simply sank crooked teeth into an unprotected spot, tearing out gobs of flesh, then instantly leapt back to make way for the next kin. They slashed at Achilles' tendons, threw themselves under the mighty legs of the Centaurs trying to topple them, blinded warriors with handfuls of caustic, limestone dust flung directly into their eyes. At the far end of the hall, the stone floor heaved again, and this time dozens of heavy, multi-ton flagstones flew aside with a dry, shattering crash. From black, gaping chasms, from forgotten ventilation shafts, from right under boots and hooves, poured a solid, seething gray tide of scaly bodies, and the air instantly filled with their piercing, merging hiss, like oil poured onto hot coals. Daryl's rangers reacted with frightening, automatic ruthlessness. Daryl himself, not moving an inch as if rooted to the stone, drew two curved blades like a predator's fangs. The first kobold that leapt at him from the shadow of a column didn't even have time to swing its long claws. His arm described a short, crushing arc, and the reptilian's head separated from its torso with a sickening, juicy crunch, rolling across the stone floor, leaving a black trail. His rangers became a whirlwind of steel and speed, constantly moving, covering each other's backs, their movements honed by years of skirmishes. One, leaping back from a suddenly yawning crack, fired a short crossbow bolt almost without aiming straight into the eye of another creature. A second met a slashing clawed paw with his long knife, deflecting it, and a third, trying to flank, was felled by a partner's accurate dagger throw. But there were thousands of kobolds. They seemed endless. They clambered from everywhere, agile and tenacious, their long, bony fingers with dirty, sharp claws grabbing at clothing, at armor clasps, trying to reach living flesh. One, slipping underfoot in the chaos, sank its teeth into a ranger's calf. That one, not uttering a sound, merely gritting his teeth to the point of crunching, crushed its skull with the heavy, steel-bound pommel of his blade. And then Brad Stoneheart, who had stood motionless until then, as if studying and assessing the space, began to move, slowly and majestically, like a volcano awakening from long slumber. His arms rose smoothly, his fingers curling into a semblance of stone claws, not to rend flesh, but to mold and shape the very matter around him. His face held neither rage nor strain, only absolute, icy concentration, turned inward, to that unthinkable depth where his will was born, alien and terrible in its unnatural calm. He seemed neither to see nor hear the chaos and cries around him. His entire mind was turned to the stone, to its ancient, immobile essence, with which he now spoke a single language. The floor beneath the feet of Daryl's unit, which was about to be completely surrounded and crushed, suddenly heaved, not cracked from a blow, but heaved, like a sea wave, ejecting half a dozen kobolds who had been digging a tunnel for a sap from the forming crevice. Brad clicked his fingers softly, almost silently, and a huge boulder by the wall, from which dozens of reptilians dangled, clinging with their claws, curved like a giant stone palm, sweeping them down in one motion, straight onto the points of dwarven halberds raised to meet them, which met the falling bodies with dull, wet smacks. He moved his hands in the air as if kneading invisible clay, and the stone around obediently repeated his motions, soft and pliable like heated wax. A group of kobolds, sensing in him the main threat, rushed at him, their yellow eyes flaring with mute hatred. Brad simply turned his palm toward them. The stone floor before them flowed, turning into shifting, viscous sand, and the creature sank waist-deep with desperate, choking hisses. Helplessly mire, in the unexpected stone quagmire. Clenching his fist with savage force, he made the walls of a narrow side passage shift with a dull, gut-deep rumble, burying the next onrushing wave of attackers, their piercing cries instantly cut off. Crushed by the inexorable weight of millennia-old rock, it was a ghastly, almost blasphemous sight. The stone behaved like a living, thinking organism, and bread was its brain and nervous system. Cracks in the walls streamed like living veins, expelling kobolds hiding within. Stone growths on columns formed into powerful, hand-like shapes, grabbing the reptilians by their limbs and flinging them to the ground, where they lay still with broken spines. When one kobold tried to press against a wall, merging with it using its natural camouflage, the stone behind it bulged, momentarily forming dense stone manacles that shackled the creature in the deadly embrace of its own element. All this occurred in complete, unnatural silence on Bread's part. Only the hissing of kobolds, the grating of shifting stone, and the heavy, rasping breath of the fighters filled the echoing hall, and they fought desperately and fiercely. The dwarves stood as an unshakable, gleaming wall, and their formation seemed poured into the very flesh of the mountain, its extension. The line of thunder hammers didn't even flinch when a new, more numerous wave of creatures crashed upon them, boring Gore throat, not taking a step forward, brought his famous maul down upon the creatures crowding before him. The blow was of monstrous, primordial force. The stone flagstones under his feet cracked, emitting a puff of gray dust, and of the kobolds remained only a bloody pulp smeared across the floor. The dwarves fought with the methodical fury of woodsmen clearing a blighted forest to the root. Their axes and halberds described short, powerful arcs, keening in the air and crunching through brittle bodies, severing clawed limbs and scaly heads. They stood wall to wall, shoulder to shoulder, their voices, hoarse and low, merging into a single, harsh battle hymn, drowned out by the clash of steel. That the creatures, quickly realizing the futility of a frontal assault on the steel wall, began to act differently, displaying their innate, vile cunning. They slashed tendons with their razor-sharp claws, threw themselves underfoot, trying to trip up the heavy, clumsy warriors in the confines. Several dwarves were already wounded. Their strong plate armor proved helpless against these crawling, low attacks from under the earth, from the darkness where none expected them. On a low stone ledge, not entering the bloody melee of close combat, the elves became the watchful eyes and punishing right hand of this erupted hell. Kneeling on one knee, Lyral smoothly and effortlessly drew the string of her long, elegant bow, and her face, usually beautiful and calm, as the still surface of a forest lake, transformed into a mask of icy, absolute concentration, detached from the horror unfolding and thus terrible in its clear ruthlessness. There was a short, dry snap of the released string, followed by a mournful, singing whistle of split air. A silver arrow sank precisely into the narrow eye socket of a kobold, preparing to leap onto Dumrin's back, and it dropped dead without a sound. The elven archers worked with murderous accuracy and cold-bloodedness. Their arrows, as if guided by an unseen thread, found the only true path into eyes, into narrow gaps beneath the scaly covering of throats. Their melodic, clear voices, seeming not to belong to this place of slaughter and din, cut through the general nose with short, crisp warnings, right by the column, or from the crack behind, and the dwarves at the wall, trusting their keen sight without question, managed to turn, presenting the surging enemy with a solid steel wall of shields and bristling halberd points. The centaurs in the tight, low hall seemed like mighty titans locked in a stone cage, and their crushing power, finding no outlet, sought any release. Vrondar, leaning heavily on his pole-like spear, used it not for precise thrusts, but as a giant, unstoppable battering ram, sweeping aside whole groups of creatures with a single motion. Each of his wide swings was like a ballista shot, breaking bones and hurling bloodied, mangled bodies several yards to smash against massive stone columns with a dull thud. Alina, seeing several kobolds trying to finish off a wounded dwarf cut off from the formation, surged forward like a whirlwind. Her 4 hooves, shod in tempered steel, came down on one creature with such force they flattened it into a bloody pancake, while her hind legs, mighty as siege rams, sent 2 others flying across the hollow until they smacked against the nearest wall, with a sickening crunch and fell still. A grim, in the very thick of the fray, was like an ancient, roused god of war come to enact his terrible and merciless judgment. His smith's hammer crushed and shattered everything in its path, leaving bloody craters and pulp in the dense mass of bodies, and every swing, accompanied by a roar of rage, was full of blind, all-consuming hatred. He strode forward, not defending himself, the thick plates of his armor humming and ringing under dozens of claw and tooth strikes like an anvil in hell. Beside him, like a shadow, guard covered his back, his broad axe describing more precise but no less deadly arcs, methodically severing limbs and splitting skulls with tireless, almost mechanical determination. Mercil, the weary Khazad, was a phantom, a sliding shadow in the very heart of the steel chaos. He slipped between the fighting giants, and his curved, cat-like claws of blades flashed, slitting throats and plunging into backs between scales, giving the enemy no chance to recover. He fought not for victory, he took vengeance, and every slain kobold was for him a small, bitter expiatory sacrifice for all his kin whose voices had fallen silent forever. In the desert sands, Dumran Ironhand stood, unshakable, in the center of the dwarven phalanx, and in his monumental figure it seemed as if the ancient granite itself had frozen in his likeness. His armor, coated with the age-old dust of hulls and fresh scratches left by claws, did not merely protect his body, it was his second skin, the scales of a mountain dragon. When another, denser wave of kobolds washed over his warriors, he did not take a step back, his feet seemingly rooted to the stone. His massive, two-handed axe, that very thunder collar that once belonged to his great-grandfather Thormund, described a wide, devastating arc in the dusty air. The blade, forged of dark dwarven steel alloy with mithril, hummed as it cleaved the air, a low drone like a distant thunderclap before a mountain storm. The blow struck three reptilians at once. The first was cleft from shoulder to thigh, the second lost its head, which flew aside with a dull thud, and the third had its rib cage shattered, collapsing with a raspy gurgle. Dark, thick blood sprayed onto Dumran's grizzled beard, but he merely wiped it away with the back of his hand, not interrupting his next swing. His eyes, like two pieces of polished anthracite, burned with a cold fire holding not blind rage, only calm, inexorable, law of nature resolve. He fought not merely as a warrior, but as a guardian of the threshold, as the embodiment of the mountain itself, and each swing of the thunder collar was a silent reminder that the dwarves would yield not an inch of their land. Not far off, in a tighter space between two massive columns, Thorben Copperbear demonstrated another, no less impressive form of combat mastery. His battle axe was not merely a weapon, but a precise, measured tool, an extension of his will. He did not hack with wasteful swings. His blows were shorter, more economical, more precise. His movements were devoid of any flourish or wasted effort, only pure, years honed efficiency. He covered the backs of the young, hot-blooded warriors of his clan, correcting their formation not with a loud cry but with a short gesture or glance. And where he stood, a small but reliable island of order rose in the chaotic, raging sea of battle. His thick beard, stained with forge soot, road dust, and sweat, swayed evenly with his breathing, deep and steady, as if he were working at a forge's bellows, not standing his ground on a field of bloody strife. And then, when a new, especially dense and furious wave of kobolds poured from the main tunnel, threatening to crush the center of the formation, Bread Stoneheart, who until then had commanded only stone and silence, finally bared his great axe of pure, white mithril. He did not draw it in a rush. He slowly, almost reluctantly, drew it from behind his back, and the steel chimed softly, but this thin, pure sound seemed for a moment to cut through and drown out all other noises of battle. He did not roar and charge into the crowd. He took only one unhurried step forward, and his axe described a slow, inexorable arc like the movement of a celestial body. It did not hack with force. It passed through the bodies of the onrushing kobolds, as a hot knife through soft butter, meeting virtually no resistance. There was no familiar crunch of bones, no wet smack of flesh, only a quiet, whispering sound of parting matter, and to bodies, neatly bisected at the waistline, soundlessly crumpled onto the bloodied stones. He fought with the same indifferent, supernatural precision with which he had earlier moved stone blocks and subdued the very earth. And this calm omnipotence was more terrible and imposing than any, even the most frenzied, rage. Seeing the dwarven lines quivering in several places and beginning to slowly retreat under the unrelenting pressure of the crawling creatures, Lyriel's elves instantly changed their tactics. Their deadly bows fell silent, yielding to long, elegant blades like petals of exotic flowers, glowing in the subterranean gloom with a cold, ghostly moonlight sheen, casting trembling reflections on the walls. They did not launch a frontal assault. did not form a line, they simply dissolved into the thick shadows by the columns, and seeped into narrow gaps between dwarven shields. Like silent phantoms born of the darkness itself, their movements, fluid and swift, merged into a single deadly dance. Lyral, barely evading a blind swing of a clawed paw, drove her slender blade precisely under the scales at the base of a kobold's skull, twisted it with a slight effort, and smoothly withdrew the bloodied blade, already twisting her torso away from a new, furious attack from the dark. Daryl's rangers, sensing the new rhythm of battle, instantly picked it up. Daryl himself, standing rooted, parried clawed paws flying at him with his curved blades, deftly intercepted the creature's limbs and with a short turn slashed their throats, never breaking his continuous, fluid movement. His half-blood seemed to have found their true element in this chaos. One, scar-covered, deliberately allowed 3 kobolds to latch onto his armor, only to then, with a short, bestial roar, crush them against the rough surface of the nearest stone column like ripe berries. The dwarves, meanwhile, stood as an immovable rock against which the waves of enemy onslaught broke. Dummerun Iron Hand again and again brought his thunder collar down with primordial, crushing force. One of his blows cleaved a low kobold from collarbone to thigh, also leaving a deep crack in the stone slab underfoot. Beside him, a graybeard, kneeling on one knee, shielded a wounded comrade with his massive shield, while his trusty axe with familiar precision severed any scaly paw, reaching for the defenseless body. Brett, like a cold star above all this bloody chaos, now wielded his mithril axe in silent and frightening harmony with his command over the stone itself. A sweep of his free hand and a stone ledge sheltering an entire kobold ambush rumbled down upon them, burying them under heaps of rubble. A turn of his blade and the head of a reptilian attacking from the flank, not having time to utter a sound, rolled across the blood-soaked floor. Cracks, like living snakes, spread across the floor before him, making creatures stumble and fall over sudden growth sprouting from the flagstones. A stone column at his gesture bent like a giant hand, curling aside another kobold that leapt from a dark opening. The great halls, silent for millennia, continued to absorb lives like an ancient, awakened altar demanding endless, ever-new sacrifices. Every detail of this vast battle, from the flash of steel to death rattles, combined into a single, epic picture of apocalypse unfolding in the very stone womb of the mountain. In this deafening hell, a strange, dissonant symphony was born. The thin whistle of elven blades, the thunderous crash of dwarven axes, the fierce, rasping cries of the rangers, and the silent, all-shattering might of bread merged into one, creating a hymn of fury and despair. They were not merely repelling an attack, every strike of theirs seared away the memory of the defilement that had polluted the ancient halls. Every fallen kobold was a brick torn from the wall that had for centuries separated them from the accursed past. That the waves of scaly creatures seemed inexhaustible and undiminished. It felt as if the subterranean darkness itself spawned them in an endless, perverted stream. From every side tunnel, from every, even the narrowest crack in the wall, poured forth new and new hordes, driven by a frenzied, merging hiss full of ancient, blind hatred for all things living and warm. Their tactics were primitive, simple, and therefore terrible in their efficiency to swamp the enemy with numbers, crush them with a raw mass of bodies, exhaust them, and finally find that single breach in the seemingly unbreakable steel wall. And a breach, to the horror of the defenders, was found. The left flank of the dwarven phalanx, where the still inexperienced young warriors of the Firehorn clan stood, could not withstand the monstrous pressure. Tenacious, bony paws seized their legs. Sharp needles of claws dug into narrow gaps between armor plates. Poison yellow teeth sank into unprotected necks. The formation wavered, cracked at the seams, and into the opening, like pus from a lanced abscess, poured a dense stream of reptilians, threatening to encircle and destroy the entire unit, cutting it off from the main force. Seeing this, Vronder's Centaurs, who had until then restrained their titanic might in the tight stone sack, moved as one. There was no need for shouts or commands. Long years of fighting side by side had honed their mutual understanding to a state of pure instinct. Vrondar, leaning on his spear, gave only a low, guttural, bear-like growl, and his kin surged forward as one. They did not charge. There was no room for a true cavalry charge in the packed hall, but their powerful, steel-shod hooves still brought crushing force of muscle and fury down upon the enemy, now choking on its own audacity. It was not a swift run, but an unstoppable, inexorable roll of a living, breathing avalanche. Alina found herself in the very thick of the fight. Her sleek, muscular body tense like a drawn bowstring before a short, powerful lead. Instead of forcing her way through the crowd of creatures, shoving aside dwarves, she pushed off with her hind legs with catapult force, leaping over the first ranks of fighters, her shadow momentarily blocking the muted torchlight looming over the fray. Landing with a dull thud right in the midst of the kobolds that had broken through, she instantly became a deadly whirlwind. Her long, sturdy spear, which she wielded like a legendary staff, described why, sweeping circles, knocking creatures off their feet, breaking bones, and hurling them aside like rag dolls. Each of her blows was precise, measured, and lethal. One she speared through the throat with the point, another, clinging to a dwarf, she brained with the reverse end of the shaft. A third, she felled with a short hoof strike to the temple with such a distinct crack that it dropped dead onto the stone without even a scream. Lorien covered her sigh, exposing his own flanks to enemy blows. His own shorter spear now worked differently, delivering not sweeping but quick, precise, thrusting strikes, plunging into bulging yellow eyes, unprotected throats, deep armpits, even the smallest unprotected spot on the scaly bodies. He breathed heavily and hoarsely, his mighty chest heaving like bellows. But he did not retreat a step, his body crisscrossed with old and new scars, becoming a living, breathing shield for his kin, taking upon itself what they should not have borne. Vrondar, seeing the seriousness of their encirclement, unleashed all his titanic might upon the densest, seething river of enemy thrusting into the formation. He did not chop elegantly or thrust precisely, he simply crushed, using his mass as a weapon. His giant spear with a massive, fist-sized head he used not as intended, bringing it down flat like a monstrous ram upon the kobolds crowded in the tight space. The dry, shattering crack of rending bones and cartilage filled the air round him. He moved through them, slowly and inexorably, like a reaper through fallen ripe wheat, and where he passed remained only a steaming bloody mash of torn bodies, and bones shattered to splinters. His grizzled, matted mane was spattered with dark blood, and in his weary eyes, at last, flared that same, long familiar and almost forgotten fire of pure, uncontrollable fury. A grim, seeing the open passage, charged into it with a roar like an underground thunderclap, clearing a path cleared by the Centaur's fury. His famous smith's hammer, describing a wide arc, came down upon a group of kobolds trying to flank the exposed dwarves. The blow was so powerful and direct it not only pulverized two creatures. The massive stone slab beneath them cracked with a crash, and several stunned reptilians tumbled with desperate, choking screams into the dark fissure that formed, their cries quickly fading into the depths. Guard walked beside him, unwaveringly, like a shadow, his heavy, unadorned woodsman's axe working tirelessly, without flourishes, but with murderous, frightening efficiency. He did not fence, did not dance a death dance. He methodically and calmly chopped wood. Each of his swings, honed by years, severed a limb, split a skull like a ripe nut, cleaved a torso in half. His face, coarse and weathered as a cliff, was utterly immobile. Only his lips pressed into a thin white line, and in his deep-set eyes stood that same unquenchable, years-accumulated melancholy that had finally found its only outlet in this cold, joyless, methodical slaughter. Mercil, meanwhile, using the chaos and confusion sown by men and centaurs, slithered like a snake even deeper into the enemy positions. He did not fight in the general formation, did not obey its rhythm. He was a lone shadow, a patient and ruthless hunter, pressing against rough walls, merging with the stone's relief and shadows. He moved soundlessly, his curved blades, like the claws of a saber-toothed predator, silently, without warning, cut short the hissing of kobolds lurking in niches, leaving behind only quickly darkening, sticky puddles at the feet of massive columns. Meanwhile, the elves, seeing the first furious onslaught of the attack begin to ebb and the formation stabilizing somewhat, returned to their original, prescribed role. Again the twang of their longbows rang in the air, but now their arrows struck not at the general, clumped mass, but at pinpoint, carefully chosen targets, leaders trying to restore order, or particularly agile creatures clambering to heights. Fanner, however, thought differently. His rage, always simmering beneath a thin shell of calm, had finally found its outlet. He did not stand in place like his kin. He moved along the hall's perimeter, his hair streaming behind him, his eyes burning with cold elven fire. His arrows, fired with elven precision, did not merely kill, they pierced two, sometimes three kobolds through, sinking into the stone walls with such force they pinned them there like revolting, convulsing butterflies in a mad god's collection. When creatures, heedless of death, got too close. He, without losing pace or showing the slightest agitation, slung his bow over his shoulder and drew his elegant, lethally honed blade, weaving short, furious, incredibly swift bursts of close combat into the general dance of death. And in the very center of this bloody vortex, Bread Stoneheart continued to fight. His mithril axe no longer shone with virginal whiteness, it was coated thick with dark, almost black blood and sticky slime, but he wielded it with the same power and precision, without fuss, without anger. He did not even seem to try to defend himself. Kobold attacks simply did not reach him, bouncing off an invisible barrier or changing trajectory at the last moment, as if he were surrounded by distorted space. All his strength, all his attention was directed outward, at pinpoint and effective support of his allies. He saw the entire battlefield whole and simultaneously, like an experienced chess player seeing the whole board, anticipating moves several steps ahead. He turned his head slightly, and his heavy gaze slid over that very wavering dwarven flank where fighting still seethed. The ground beneath the feet of the kobolds that had broken through suddenly shifted, swayed, turning into shifting, sucking stone sand, slowly but inexorably dragging them into its cold embrace. Then his attention was caught by the desperate situation of Daryl's rangers, cut off and tightly surrounded in a narrow, bottleneck side passage. Bread did not even stir, only narrowed his eyes slightly. The ceiling in that very passage groaned with a dull, gut-deep moan and sagged, dropping several tons of ancient stone upon the heads of the enraged kobolds, burying them forever under heaps of sharp debris. The rangers, surviving literally by a miracle, froze for a moment in mute shock, then, meeting Bread's gaze, nodded curtly, expressing silent, sparse gratitude to the motionless figure in the very center of hell. The battle lasted an eternity. Time in the deeps lost all meaning. Torches burned down one after another and were replaced, but the gloom seemed only to thicken from it, fed by the inexhaustible malice of countless foes. The air in the hall grew thick and heavy, saturated with the nauseating reek of spilled blood, beastly excrement, and the sweetish smell of death. Fatigue, heavy as lead, settled on the shoulders and soles of the warriors. Muscles burned with fire, and one sharp blades and axes dulled, ringing dully against hard bones and tough scales. And then, when it seemed this bloody nightmare had no end and would have none, the battle suddenly, almost unnaturally, turned. Not due to some hero's lone feat, but because the very source of the enemy's fury seemed to dry up. The endless stream of kobolds began to thin. The hissing waves of their attacks grew less furious and coordinated, losing their initial, crushing momentum. The last of the creatures, seeing the mountains of their dead kin towering around and that same unbreakable wall of steel, flesh, and animated stone that had devoured their brethren, faltered. Their animal, instinctive terror finally overcame blind malice. They began to retreat, backing away, crawling back into dark, gaping crevices, soundlessly dissolving into the thick shadows from which they had emerged mere hours ago. Like ghosts, the great hall, recently deafened by battle's roar, fell silent. The silence after the long, exhausting hours of fighting was deafening, oppressive, hanging in the air like a heavy, invisible pall. It was now broken only by the heavy, ragged, whistling breathing of the surviving warriors, the dull moans of the wounded from various corners, and the steady, even drip of water, and somewhere of dark, congealed blood falling from the soot-blackened high vaults. The bodies lying everywhere in heaps made the stone floor resemble a hellish, writhing carpet of flesh, scales, and armor fragments in the torchlight. Dummer, iron hand, leaning heavily on his famous axe, from whose broad blade black blood dripped in thick drops, slowly, painfully swept the hall with his gaze. His dwarves, his children of stone, had not faltered, had not fled, that the losses were keen and bitter. He saw familiar, dear faces forever frozen in the mask of final battle, their beards, once lovingly braided, now tangled and soaked with blood. His palms, calloused and hardened from decades of work with metal and weapons, were now numb and trembling from the long, draining fury. Every muscle in his mighty body burned with fire, but in his eyes, like two pieces of polished anthracite, there was not a shadow of fatigue, only cold, razor-sharp resolve, the kind that makes the body obey when the soul is already wounded and torn asunder. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing ingrained soot, sweat, and dried blood into a single, terrible warrior's mask that knew no mercy. Reform. His voice, hoarse from shouting and strain, rumbled under the vaults, though without the usual shattering thunder. and it was only that same steely, unbending will that forces legs to move forward when every cell of the body screams to stop and fall. Shields in line, healers to the wounded. The rest cleared the passages and fortify positions. Quickly, no one argued, there were no cries or unnecessary questions. Dwarves, elves, men, and centaurs, all who could still stand, whose hands could still grip weapons or haul stones, began to move with that slow, automatic precision born only of long years of wars and campaigns. On the brink of destruction, this was no longer battle fervor, no rage, but cold, mechanical, joyless work of survival, familiar to any who had ever looked death in its empty sockets. The first to come to aid, as harbingers of light in this kingdom of death, were the elves. It seemed as if nature and harmony itself in their guise hastened to heal the wounds inflicted by the ugliness and chaos of battle. Iviel, her delicate, almost transparent, elegant hands already stained with alien blood and mountain grime, slid soundlessly between bodies like a quiet angel. Her eyes, the color of a clear spring sky, were now full of bottomless, ancient sorrow. But her fingers moved swiftly, confidently, and tenderly. She knelt beside a young, beardless dwarf of the fire horns, who was vainly trying to stem a deep, gaping wound in his side with his palm, dark, thick blood seeping through his fingers. A quiet, melodic whisper in ancient Elvish, a light, almost weightless touch, and a warm, golden, living light enveloped the terrible wound, slowing the deadly bleeding. Beside her, working without looking, their own dwarven healers plied their tray, their stern, battle-tested craft of healing, mixing with the power of elven bombs caustic antiseptics. Smelling of sulfur and coal made the wounded grit their teeth to the point of crunching with pain. But they stopped infection, carrying with them the scent of iron and bitter herbs. Daryl's rangers, not wasting energy on empty words or lamentations, silently, with stone-faced expressions, took on the grim and necessary work. They dragged the bodies of the fallen kobolds, still warm and sticky, into piles by the far, dark walls, freeing space for defense and for the living. Their movements were economical, precise, devoid of any fuss or disgust. The smell of death, Swedish, heavy, and cloying, was as familiar to them as the scent of autumn rain or a coniferous forest. But this familiarity made it no lighter or more pleasant. A grim manned guard, their once proud titanic shoulders now slumped under an invisible burden of weariness and grief, silently helped clear the heaviest rubble. Their titanic strength, which mere hours ago had crushed foes by the dozen, was now directed to heaving together, with a strained roar, the multi-ton boulder that had fallen during the battle, crushing to dwarven crossbowmen to death. From under it only someone's bloody, bruised hand protruded, still clutching the shaft of a crossbow. The centaurs, unsuited for delicate work in the cramped, rubble-choked space, formed a living, breathing perimeter on the most dangerous approaches to the main tunnel, from where new threats were expected. Vrondar stood, leaning heavily on his long spear as on a crutch, his gaze, sharp and accustomed to boundless steppe expanses, bored with hatred and longing into the impenetrable, silent darkness ahead. Alina, stepping carefully with her hooves among the debris, moved among her kin with a quiet, muffled voice, checking their condition, hastily bandaging wounds received in the fight. In the very center of the hall, immovable as an ancient, earth-rooted man here, stood Bread Stoneheart. He did not help the wounded, did not comfort the dying, did not clear rubble. He simply stood, his broad, powerful palms with rough, gnarled fingers like entwined roots of ancient trees lying flat upon the cold, rough stone floor. He seemed not even to breathe, his chest not rising with the heavy rhythm of those around him. He listened, not with his ears, but with his entire essence, fused with the mountain rock, with every particle of it. From him emanated a low, almost intangible but skin-prickling vibration. The stone slabs beneath his bare feet shifted slightly, filling with new strength, sealing small but dangerous cracks. He was strengthening the very foundation of their temporary refuge, knowing intuitively that tomorrow, perhaps, the solidity of this very stone would determine someone's life. His silent presence was like a deep, subterranean, earthcore hum, quiet but constant, reminding all of that ancient, mute power upon which they all now relied as their last hope. Lyral, having shed her cloak of finest gray linen, now stained with brownish blood spots and gray dust, approached him soundlessly, like a shadow. Her face, usually beautiful and aloof as a lunar visage, was deathly pale and expressed a profound, soul-exhausting weariness, but in her eyes, large, almond-shaped, and the color of a clear spring sky, burned the same unquenchable fire as in Dumran's the fire of unbroken will, ready to go to the end. "That was but a first probe, a test, was it not?" she asked softly, almost whispering, and her voice, pure, sorrowful, and ringing, sounded especially loud and piercing in the oppressive, quivering silence of the hall. "A trial of our strength, a test of our spirit and the solidity of our formation." Bread slowly, with that heavy fluidity inherent in his every motion, turned his head toward her. His eyes, deep and dark as the most abandoned, bottomless mine shafts, met her direct, questioning gaze. They held no ready answer, only a bottomless, all-seeing and all-knowing comprehension that sent icy shivers down the spine and tightened the throat. "Tomorrow," he uttered, and his voice was low and like the distant, subterranean rumble of a beginning landslide, "they will show their true faces. Not these spawn of gloom that crawl upon the floor and through the stone's thickness, but those who let that gloom into the sacred halls, who willingly open the gates, and the very walls that for centuries were meant to protect will turn against us, become our jailers and executioners." He stared again into the impenetrable darkness of the main tunnel, and his heavy, portentous silence was at that moment more eloquent than any loud words. They had repelled the first, furious assault, but everyone, from the white-haired elder to the young warrior, understood the real, main battle for Khazad Gatol, for the cradle and very heart of the dwarven people, was only just beginning, and the price for each step deeper into this defiled stronghold would be measured not in liters of black kobold blood, but in the scarlet blood of those who now, in the ringing, weary silence, bandaged wounds, sharpened blades, and silently prepared to meet a new, even more terrible day. The night passed in tense, almost physically palpable expectation. That the ominous silence beyond the walls of their temporary refuge was never broken. No new waves of attacks, no familiar menacing scraping of claws on stone, none of that dry, crackling, bone-burning laughter that etched itself into memory and denied sleep. This silence was deceptive, viscous and dense like honey congealing in ice water. All who retained a grain of sober reason understood beyond these gates, in the labyrinth of defiled halls of Khazad Gatol, they were known, their approximate numbers, their deadly weariness, the disposition of their forces. And there, with cold cruelty, preparations were being made for the meeting with dawn, which in the eternal deeps could only be guessed by the changing of the guard and the fading of some of the oldest torches. A grim, emotionless bustle settled over the vast hall. Like a giant, wounded but unbroken beast, the allied army licked its wounds and gathered strength, preparing for the decisive, final lunge into the jaws of the unknown. Dumran Iron Hand, having silently walked the ranks of his warriors, mechanically clenched and unclenched his mighty fists encased in a steel gauntlet, scored with fresh notches. He looked upon the soot-stained, weary but unbowed faces of the dwarves, the empty, inward-turned eyes of the men, the silent, almost tangible tension of the elves. He saw Grim sitting on a column fragment, his face a stone mask as he ground the battle-notched edge of his hammer against a whetstone, each scrape of steel on rough stone sounding like the furious grinding of teeth. "A fine, reliable tool," Dumran growled without preamble, nodding at the hammer. "Plain forge work, no frills, but honest, built to last." A Grim slowly, as if through effort, raised his eyes to him. In those eyes, weary to the point of numbness and full of mute, seething rage, there flashed for an instant something like understanding and even respect. He gave a short nod, squeezing the worn haft so hard his knuckles whitened. "It was my grandfather's," a Grim replied gruffly, abruptly. "Then my father's. They forged more horseshoes and plowshares a lifetime than I can recall." And lately he didn't finish, cutting the phrase short, but Dumran understood without words. The hammer, once serving creation and life, now only crushed and brought death. "Good. Stout steel must not bend or break under the blows of fate," Dumran said, his hoarse voice taking on notes unrelated to war, grievance, or rage for the first time. "It must withstand them to the very end." Nearby, in the shadows, sat Guard, silently observing the dwarven chieftain, saying nothing as he methodically rewrapped his axe's haft with fresh, stiff leather straps, his movements slow, precise, and measured, like an experienced woodsman preparing his main tool before felling a centuries-old, stubborn oak. Dumran, completing his somber inspection of positions, lowered himself heavily, with a dull clang of armor, onto a low stone ledge beside Thorben Copperbeard. The latter, with his usual unflappable air, was studying the complex, Tangled web of fine lines carved on a flat stone slab, an ancient map of Khazad Gatol's tunnels, covered with his own notes on mechanical traps and deadfalls. "They're sniffing out our weakness," Dumrin rasped wearily, removing his heavy, dented helmet. His face, coated in sweat, soot, and dried blood, seemed carved from old, wrinkled granite. "They scent fatigue like hungry hounds, and they wait, patiently wait, for us to crack under the weight of this pressing stone and our own wounds." Thorben, not lifting his intent gaze from the map, slowly traced one particularly winding line denoting a narrow ventilation shaft, leading into the deepest depths with a work-calloused finger. "Cold calculation is their main weapon, Dumrin. Well, let it become ours as well." His voice sounded even and methodical, as if discussing blueprints for a new steam mechanism or a ventilation shaft scheme. "They now know for certain we're here, holed up like rats in a trap, and we know they're there, beyond that darkness, sharpening their teeth. Now it all comes down to one thing: endurance. Nerf. Whoever first fails to bear this tension, falters or charges ahead blindly loses, without even properly crossing steel." Dumrin, finally finishing his unhurried rounds, returned with heavy, measured steps to a grim. In his hands, encased in steel gauntlets, lay a long, narrow leather sheath, sewn from thick, untanned kavox high and stitched for durability with thin mithril thread glinting in the gloom. "Take it," he said curtly and without emotion, handing the bundle to the smith. "Your old, faithful hammer has seen many battles and served well, I can see by the notches. But for what awaits us ahead, in the deepest halls, different steel is needed. Stronger." A grim slowly, almost reverently, untied the stiff leather laces. From the sheath emerged a war hammer that radiated mute, crushing might. A solid, cast construction of dark, almost black dwarven steel, polished not to a shine but to a matte, deep luster, lay perfectly, as if poured into his calloused palm. The hammerhead had a massive, square striking face on one side, capable of flattening any helmet, and on the other, a sharp, curved beak designed to pierce the strongest armor and tear it away in chunks. But the main thing in the very texture of the steel one could discern that special, unique craftsmanship that at first glance distinguished the weapons of the great dwarven masters. A barely perceptible, wavy pattern like frost crystals, testifying to multiple ray-forgings and quenchings in the icy waters of subterranean springs. "This is..." A grim froze, turning the incredibly balanced hammer in his work-worn hands. He felt its perfect, dead weight, that special, confident heaviness that spoke of quality. Dense steel, free of voice. Such a hammer, a weapon like this belongs in the hands of a king or a high commander, not a simple smith. It belongs where it is most needed, where it will be of greatest use. Dumrin interrupted him harshly. His eyes, like two pieces of polished anthracite, stared intently and unwaveringly at a grim. "The finest masters of the iron hand forged it for me. 3 full lunar cycles, they tempered the blank in the icy water of a mountain lake, before even beginning the forging. It is called Thunder of the Deeps." He made a small, weighty pause, letting his words sink into the smith's very consciousness. "Let the enemy hear its voice, and let that voice be the last thing they hear in this life." A grin gripped the hammer's haft, and his fingers found the perfect grip indentations on their own. In his eyes, besides the habitual rage and unquenchable grief, a new spark flared and froze, something like profound gratitude and increased, pressing responsibility. He nodded silently, heavily, understanding in his very gut that in his hands now lay not merely a chunk of lethal metal, but a true symbol of trust and recognition from an entire people. Dumrin, seeing this mute but crystal-clear understanding, turned on his heel and walked away with his heavy, unhurried, glacier-like gait. He neither expected nor wanted verbal thanks. The very fact that this hammer, this heirloom, would be in reliable and strong hands, was for him the highest and best reward. And when the final preparations were complete, all wounds bandaged, and blades sharpened, Dumrin silently, with a single gesture, gave the sign to march. There were no loud, pompous exhortations, no solemn, fiery speeches, only a short, honed sweep of the hand, clear and visible to all who had long served under his stern command. The silence ringing under the colossal vaults of the hall gave way to the measure, restrained but powerful hum of thousands of footsteps. The great, motley host came to motion as a single organism. They marched slowly, unhurriedly, as befitted children of stone, whose leisurely steps measured whole centuries. The broad, long-unused tunnel leading to the fortress itself swallowed them in an endless, dark stream. Ahead, as a silent vanguard, slid the gray shadows of Daryl's rangers, their eyes trained for eternal half-light, searching out every suspicious crack, every irregularity on walls and underfoot where an ambush or trap might lurk. Behind them, a heavy and inexorable wave, moved the close-knit dwarven phalanxes with a dull clash of steel. The steel of their armor gleamed dully, reflecting a reddish sheen in the light of March torches. And their faces under horned, closed helms were stern, inscrutable, and silent. They did not speak. They hoarded silence, gathering within themselves that ancient, mute fury that had led them through long years of defeat and humiliation straight to this decisive hour. Behind, maintaining a sensible distance, marched their unusual allies. Lyriel's elves moved with their inherent noiseless, almost airy grace, but even their usually calm, detached faces were tense and pale. The men, Centaurs, the lone Khazad Gatol of them, each in their own way, felt the oppressive weight of what was to come. This was not just another battle. This was a return, a deadly step into the past that was to determine all their future. The air in the tunnel grew ever heavier, denser, and more stifling as they advanced. Through the familiar scent of ancient dust and damp stone began to penetrate distinctly another, alien and revolting odor, the sweetish stench of decay, the acrid smoke of alien cook fires, and something else, bitter and metallic, that tickled the nostrils, settled in the throat, and involuntarily made one grip weapon hilts tighter. Dumrin marched in the very front ranks, his massive, steel-clad figure like a living crag sailing down a subterranean river. His gaze, heavy and inexorable, was fixed only forward, on that very point where the tunnel was to lead them to their cherished goal. He did not turn, did not look back at those marching behind. He knew that behind him marched not merely a motley army. Behind him marched the will of an entire people, its centuries-old pain, its memory, and its last, fragile hope. To duty that had awaited its hour for long years now led them forward, and they could not, had no right to retreat. Not before the face of the advancing darkness threatening to swallow their home. Not before the face of their own past that awaited them around this bend, in the gaping, wand-like maw of the defiled gates of Khazad Gatol. The great host halted in a vast, cavernous hall resembling a giant stone sack with high vaults, and somewhere ahead, beyond another dark turn, lay the exit to the very walls of the fortress. It was here, in this last haven before the decisive launch, that the measured, authoritative, das sound of a dwarven war horn rang out. Its low roar, born in the copper depths of an ancient instrument forged in the times of the Great Alliance, rolled under the high, echoing vaults and made the very air, filled with dust, shudder. All froze as one. Dwarves, men, elves, centaurs, all heads turned toward the source of this commanding sound. On a massive stone outcrop serving as an improvised tribune stood, drawn up to his full, not great height, Dumrin Iron Hand. Beside him, motionless and majestic as the mountain itself, stood Bread Stoneheart. His presence like the oppressive silence before a storm. The multi-thousand army of dwarf stern warriors of the Iron Hand. Pragmatic masters of the Copperbeards, furious berserkers of the Thunder Hammers, the enigmatic Rune Wardens, all the great clans that had answered the call filled the colossal hall with solid, polished to a mirror-sheen ranks. The steel of their plate and mail gleamed with a dull, red sheen in the flickering light of hundreds of torches, and countless axes, halberds, and warhammers rose above their heads in a single, grim and motionless forest. They stood in complete, almost unnatural silence. But this silence was more eloquent and louder than any battle cry, and it was distinctly heard the heavy echo of bygone glory, inflicted wrongs, and an unbreakable will, solid as the granite itself. Dumrin, standing on the elevation, swept this motley, a tightly united by common grief and white-hot fury host with his heavy, leaden slab gaze, absorbing the sternness of thousands of faces, children of stone, faithful allies from the bright forests and boundless steppes. His voice, accustomed to commanding storms in forged hearts and moving rubble with a whir, thunder under the very vaults, drowning out even the insistent crackle of pitch torches. We stand upon the very threshold. Beyond these ancient gates lies not merely a fortress of stone and steel. Beyond them lies our heart, carved from the very mountain, our memory, etched in runes, the cradle of all our race, defiled, spat upon, and turned to ruin. He stretched out his hand, encased in steel, toward the majestic, but silent, and dead gates leading into the mountain's depths. There, in the sacred, smoke-filled forges where our creative hammers once rang, birthing masterpieces, now hull the spawn of darkness. There, where in peace rested the decaying ashes of our great ancestors in granite sarcophagi, now rots their filth, their abominable altars. They think they have defiled our history, ground it to dust. They think us broken and vanquished. Dumorin struck his chest with a gauntleted fist, and a deafening clang of steel rolled through the hall like an alarm bell. That they are mistaken, and that mistake shall be their last. So long as the blood of our ancestors flows in our veins, so long as our hearts beat in unison with the eternal heart of the mountain, Khazad Gatol shall be ours. The roar that rose in answer was akin to a powerful subterranean tremor. The dwarves fiercely beat halberd shafts and axe butts against their sturdy shields. Rangers raised blades to the invisible sky. Elves lifted their long bows in a single surge, and centaurs beat heavy hooves against the stone floor in unison. And all this deafening crash merged into a single, all-shattering hymn of vengeance and unshakable resolve. Today we go not merely to reclaim a pile of cold stones. Dumorin continued as the spontaneous din began to subside, transitioning into tense attention. Today we shall sear the very defilement from this place's memory with red-hot ire. We shall restore its lost honor. We shall show all creatures of the deeps and all the world that dwarves have not forgotten their duty to the bones of their forebears, and that those who dared spit upon our heritage shall know the full might and fury of our steel. He turned to Bread, standing motionless as a statue. The latter slowly, majestically nodded, and his bottomless, all-seeing gaze seemed to touch every warrior in the hall, instilling in hearts not only battle rage, but a particle of that ancient, stone-like immutability that was the very essence of his being. For Khazad Gatol, roared Dumorin, raising high his famed axe thundercaller, for the fallen ancestors, for the coming generations who must see the sun. His mighty cry was immediately taken up by the entire multi-thousand host, and in this deafening, primordial roar, in the blinding gleam of thousands of raised blades, in the stern, petrified faces of warriors ready without hesitation to die for their shrine, was something immeasurably greater than mere preparation for another assault. It was the birth of a new legend, and that would be sung for centuries, the beginning of a great siege that was either to return to the dwarves their stolen soul, or become for them forever a funeral chant under the silent, indifferent vaults of their greatest citadel, the great tunnel, hewn centuries ago in the stone womb of the dragon's spine, finally brought them out onto a vast, plaza-like subterranean parade ground. And here the breath caught in every throat, even of the most seasoned and impassive warriors who had seen much in their lives. Before them, rising with colossal, time-darkened vaults into impenetrable, almost tangible gloom, towered Khazad Gatol, the impregnable stronghold, carved from solid rock monoliths, seemed part of the mountain itself. Colossal basalt columns, thick as entire fortress towers, supported the invisible ceiling high above, and at the end of the parade ground gaped the main gates, cast from solid, dully gleaming adamant, with bolts thick as oak trunks. But this was not the proud, shining citadel of ancient legends and songs. The air here was thick, dead, and stifling, saturated with the smell of old mold, wet dead earth, and acrid, chemical reek biting the nostrils of its former might, reliability, and grandeur. No trace remained, only a crushing, soundless gloom instilling terror, and an oppressive sense of all-consuming nightmare, full of the desecration of history itself. The army froze, silently and swiftly deploying into clear battle formations at the very edge of the enormous parade ground. The dwarves locked their heavy shields, creating an impenetrable steel wall. The elves, like shadows, dispersed on the flanks, their deadly bows drawn and ready for a volley. The centaurs took up a key position in the center, ready to set into motion the ram towers and siege engines constructed by the copper-beard artisans. All stood frozen in tense, ringing expectation, peering into the dead, sealed gates behind which the unknown lurked. And when Dumorin, standing in the front ranks, clenched his steel fist, his vast army surged into motion, and thousands of dwarves, like a single entity, rushed toward the gates under the cover of their shields. But what happened next, none of the wise strategists, none of the experienced commanders had foreseen. With an ear-splitting, piercing screech these ancient walls had not heard for many centuries, the gates of solid adamant themselves began to move. They did not swing open triumphantly, they crashed outward with a monstrous roar, as if torn from their mighty hinges by an unknown internal force that had been gathering in the fortress bowels. The multi-ton, colossal leaves, falling, turned into giant, inexorable guillotines. The first, most disciplined ranks of dwarves from the Iron Hand clan, not even having time to comprehend what was happening, were simply crushed into bloody pulp, a hideous crunch of bones, deafening clang of shattering steel, and short, cut-off cries all instantly drowned in the crash of collapse that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. From the thick cloud of acrid stone dust and billows of choking stench that poured from the black breach upon the stunned, momentarily frozen warriors fell a veritable hell, descended from the abyss, to first to appear, casting gigantic shadows in the torchlight, were they, dozens of trolls, these mountain-like giants with bumpy, wet granite-colored skin, whose height forced even the centaurs to crane their necks, filled the opening. Their long, sinewy arms ending in clawed fingers capable of tearing rock, rose up for a strike. A dull roar of pure fury erupted from their massive jaws that could snap a steel bar. They strode forward, paying no heed to arrows sinking into their thick, armor-like hide, and the first sweeping blow of one of them scattered the built dwarven phalanx like ninepins. And behind the trolls' backs, from the very bowels of the defiled fortress, poured a true, seething river. An endless, teeming flood of goblins, their scrawny, weary bodies in filthy clothes stitched from scraps of leather, their predatory, leering grins and burning yellow eyes full of greed and mute malice. They did not form orderly ranks, they filled all available space, rolled in a solid, shrieking wave, brandishing crude but razor-sharp jagged blades and hooks. The air instantly thickened and became unbearable from their stench, acrid sweat, sweetish smell of rot, and something caustic, chemical, eating at the mucous membranes. But this was not all. While the main allied forces were locked in mortal combat with the trolls and the main goblin horde, from under the very stone of the parade ground, from forgotten ventilation shafts and drainage tunnels, known only from the most ancient chronicles, came a revolting, mass rustle like dry leaves. It seemed the very stone around was stirring. From every crack, every dark corner, from under rubble crawled kobolds, dozens, hundreds of scaly, agile creatures with glowing, sulphurous yellow eyes. They did not launch frontal assaults, they darted out like locusts, sinking sharp claws and teeth into legs, slashing tendons, blinding warriors with handfuls of caustic limestone dust flung into faces. Their innate art of trap-making now turned against the besiegers. Stone slabs under the warriors' feet suddenly gave way, dragging them into deep pits lined with spikes poisoned with cave fungus juice. The great four-gate hall was transformed in an instant into a giant, roaring meat grinder, where each survived as best he could. Dummer Iron Hand, finding himself by fate's will not far from the collapsed gates, charged at the nearest troll with a roar of primordial fury. His legendary axe Thundercaller, heirloom of great ancestors, described a crushing arc in the air. The blow, channeling all the dwarf's might, struck the monster's knee. There was a deafening, dry crunch, but the troll, merely roaring louder in pain, swung its club cobbled from fragments of dwarven statues. Dummerin barely had time to instinctively raise his shield. The blow was of monstrous force. The sturdy shield of tempered dwarven steel cracked, and the dwarf himself was hurled aside several paces like a splinter, forcing him to struggle back to his feet. A grim, gripping the gifted hammer thunder of the deeps till it hurt, met the next onrushing wave of goblins. His titanic hammer crushed everything in its path without distinction or mercy. Each swing left a bloody crater in the dense, squirming mass of bodies. But goblins, cowardly alone, became lethally dangerous in a huge mob. They threw themselves underfoot, clung to armor plates, trying to reach unprotected flesh. One, particularly agile, with a bloodied hook instead of a hand, managed to leap onto a Grimm's back. But before he could sink his weapon into the neck, a shadow slid by, and the goblin's head flew from its shoulders with a sickening crunch. It was Mercil. The Khazad, not uttering a sound, was already dissolving into the thick of battle, his curved blades like saber-toothed predator claws working incessantly, slitting throats and opening bellies. On the flanks, retaining their composure, the elves waged their own special war. Lyril, standing on a slight elevation of rubble, loosed arrow after arrow with murderous accuracy. Each found its mark, in the single eye of a troll trying to crush a group of dwarven crossbowmen, in the throat of a goblin chieftain gathering his kin for a new assault. Vanner did not stand still, and his long-restrained rage finally broke free. He moved along the most dangerous perimeter, his double arrows finding targets and piercing them through, pinning them to the ground or stone walls. When creatures got too close, he, with a short furious cry in his tongue, slung his bow and drew his elegant blade, weaving into close combat with lethal grace. The Centaurs, finally, were in their element. Their crushing might, previously constrained in narrow tunnels, now burst forth. Vrondar led his kin in a devastating charge. They crashed into the flank of the advancing goblin horde like a living, unstoppable battering ram. Their powerful steel-shod hooves shattered bones, and long, heavy spears impaled several bodies at once, skewering them like meat on a spit. Alina, acting in a coordinated pair with Lorien, skillfully cut off small groups of goblins from the main force, preventing them from surrounding individual dwarves. The most terrible and unexpected weapon for the goblins holed up in Khazad Gatol became Bread Stoneheart. He did not rush into the thick of the fray with a roar. He stood behind the main forces, immovable as a menhir, and the stone around him literally came alive, obeying his will. At a wave of his hand, the ground beneath the feet of a tight group of trolls suddenly flowed, dragging them into a shifting stone trap. The wall behind Daryl's rangers, who were cut off and pressed against the cliff, suddenly bulged in a wave, dumping a heap of sharp debris upon the pressing goblins. He was the cold, calculating brain of this desperate defense, and his ancient, mountain-fused strength was in that moment the only thing holding back the crushing onslaught of the Defiler's overwhelming force. The siege of Khazad Gatol turned into a sheer, deafening hell unleashed at the very foot of the citadel, where every inch of ground had to be washed in blood and wrested with fierce fury. From the countless spawn of darkness that had turned the great shrine into their pernicious, foul-smelling lair, the stone parade ground, once the paved, smooth approach to the great citadel, now lay buried in mangled bodies, armor fragments, and dark puddles slowly seeping into cracks between stones. The dwarves, locking their heavy shields into a single, gleaming steel wall, held with that furious, blind stubbornness worthy of their great ancestors. But even the strongest steel and boundless courage could not always withstand monstrous, primal force. One of the trolls, as if not noticing the dozens of wounds from dwarven axes and elven arrows sticking from its back, like porcupine quills, crashed its entire bulk into the dense formation of the Thunderhammer's clan. Its club, roughly hewn from a fragment of a stone beam, came down on the shield wall with avalanche force. There was a deafening, metallic crash of shattering steel and crunch of bones. Several dwarves were smeared across the stone into bloody pulp. Others, hurled aside with caved-in chests, dropped dead without uttering a dying sound. Nearby, a young dwarf of the Iron Hand tried to shield the wounded comrade with his shield, and took upon it the crushing blow of another troll's clawed paw. The shield was crumpled like parchment, and the dwarf himself was hurled like a splinter against the nearest granite column. He slid down its rough surface, leaving a long bloody trail, and moved no more. It was in this bloody, deafening turmoil that guard fell. The burly giant, covering a Grimm's back with his mighty frame to his last breath, was suddenly surrounded by a whole pack of shrieking goblins. His faithful axe, which had, until then, faithfully severed heads and limbs, momentarily lodged in the ribs of a massive foe. That second was enough. With a revolting hiss, from yonder a pile of still-warm corpses darted an agile kobold and with a razor-sharp claw slit guard's hamstring. The titan, not uttering a sound, swayed heavily, and in that moment a dozen goblin spears and hooks sank into his mighty, armor-unprotected torso. Guard, not groaning, only breathing heavily and hoarsely, kept hacking around him for a while, already on one knee, until a troll stepped on him with its multi-ton, millstone-like foot. The bone crunch sounded muffled, as if a beam had snapped underground. Of the giant remained only a spreading bloody puddle and a fragment of his faithful axe's haft. On the flanks, where the elves with cold fury repelled endless, exhausting attacks, the immortal scarlet blood also flowed. Tarlin, the massive sentinel, who had been an unshakable pillar of defense, took upon himself a crushing blow meant for the wounded Sinal. A huge, roughly hewn stone boulder hurled by a troll struck him square in the chest. There was a horrifying, dry sound of breaking armor plates and ribs. Tarlin flew back like a rag doll, struck a rough wall, and went still, his lifeless body frozen in a pose as if still shielding his kin. Sinal, the young archer with eyes full of tears of fury and horror, rose to avenge the fallen, but was immediately struck down by a hail of poisoned, stinking darts launched from the depths of the goblin ranks. He fell to his knees, convulsively gasping for reek-filled air, and his last clouded gaze held childish bewilderment and unspoken pain. Old Halder, trying to shield the falling youth with his own body, took a precise blow from a curved blade to the neck as he turned. He did not fall at once, but turned and managed to whisper something in ancient Elvish before his steel heart, which had held wisdom for centuries, stopped forever. His wise eyes, which had seen the dawns and sunsets of entire epochs, stared up at the stone vault, no longer seeing it. The Centaurs, whose crushing fury in open battle knew no equal, on this confined parade ground, became easy, massive prey for the trolls. Powerful, irresistible blows from clubs and stone fists rained upon them from the side and rear. One troll, seizing a young centaur by the haunch and neck, simply tore him in half like a rag with an ear-splitting crack of rending tendons and spine. Vrondar, seeing the death of his kin, let out a guttural roar of deepest despair and fury. His long spear pierced the eye of the attacking troll, but another, flanking him, struck his legs with its club. The old, experienced warrior crashed onto the stones with a crunch, and only his sturdy armor and mighty will saved him from immediate, agonizing death. Alina, trying with desperate leaps to cover the fallen leader, found herself in a tight ring of enemies. Her elegant bow was broken, spear knocked from her hands, and she fought back with her 4 hooves alone until she was felled by a blow to the legs. Her fate would have been sealed that same instant had it not been for the furious, suicidal countercharge of the surviving centaurs, who hacked into the crowd to save their own at the cost of their lives. But the enemy also suffered even more monstrous and irreplaceable losses. Bread Stoneheart was ruthless and precise in his vengeance. The stone of the parade ground came alive and obeyed his will. Beneath the feet of the densest goblin formations, the earth suddenly turned to shifting, sucking stone sand, burying dozens of creatures alive. Walls along the sides of the parade ground collapsed with a dull rumble, deliberately burying entire detachments under tons of rubble. He directed sharp stone spikes under the feet of advancing trolls, making them stumble and fall right into the concentrated hail of dwarven axes and elven arrows. His every spare gesture, every movement of thought meant death for whole enemy squads. Dwarven steel, guided by Dumran's blind rage and Thorbin's cold, pragmatic calculation, mowed goblins down in whole rows like ripe wheat. It was a slaughter, terrible and merciless, but a mutual slaughter, where for every step forward, every scrap of land wrested from the darkness, one had to pay in whole rivers of blood, one's own and the enemy's. The battle raged on, not abating for an instant, knowing neither respite nor mercy, turning into a giant, roaring meat grinder, where supreme heroism and self-sacrifice mingled bizarrely with animal terror and faceless death under the silent, indifferent vaults of the defiled citadel. The very air seemed to hum and ring with the clash of steel, soul-rending cries, and death rattles. On every, even the smallest patch of stone parade ground, seethed its own, separate, desperate and furious drama, and the outcome of each was written in blood on the cold, impassive stone. On the right, where the dwarves of the copper-beard clan under Thorbin's leadership tried to hold a breach, went a ruthless and methodical fight akin to the grinding of millstones crushing bones. The air there was thick with the smell of burning oil, sweat, and the coppery stench of fresh blood. The dwarves, using remnants of ruined siege towers, had erected an improvised barricade, and the gaps between twisted beams were tightly packed with fallen shields and enemy bodies, creating a flimsy, a stubborn fortification. But a troll, enraged by dozens of wounds like bee stings, seized the iron frame of an assault tower and began tearing it apart like a child with a toy. The soul-chilling screech of rending metal momentarily drowned out the battle's roar, and fragments sharp as razors flew in all directions, striking friend and foe alike. One such shard, whizzing through the air with a thin, vicious sound, lodged in the eye socket of a young dwarf standing beside Thorbin. He didn't even cry out, made no sound, he simply dropped dead as if felled, and a scarlet trickle slowly crept along the notched edge of his pauldron. Thorbin, not looking away, continued giving commands, his voice firm and calm as granite, his face a mask of cold fury, but his fingers gripping the axe haft whitened with such effort, betraying the storm raging within him. This echo of death from the right merged with the central din of battle, where the main clash with the goblin horde seethed. Here a grim, bloodied from head to toe, became the living embodiment of vengeance, an inexorable instrument of retribution. His new hammer thunder of the deeps hummed, tracing bloody patterns in the air, and each explosive blow not only scattered goblin bodies like splinters, but hammered their fragile bones into the sticky, compacted earth. But there were too many of them, a whole sea of faces distorted by malice, and with each swing of the hammer, which made ears ring, a grim strength ebbed like snow under hot breath. Beside him, covering his back, fought Mercil. The Khazad had long lost count of the slain. His movements had become mechanical, a death dance honed by years of training, and on his blades, like curved claws, deep notches mixed with scales and entrails, emitting a sweetish nauseating smell. Suddenly one goblin, playing dead, seized his leg, and a sharp, burning pain pierced his weary body. Mercil hissed, more bestial than rational, turned, and drove his blade into the creature's throat. But in that moment another goblin stabbed him in the side with a spear. Khazad sagged, cursing hoarsely in his guttural tongue, and tried to rise, feeling the warmth of life seeping through torn skin, but his leg wouldn't obey. Suddenly heavy and alien, on the left, where the elves tried to hold back the endless stream of enemies from side tunnels, reigned its own, quiet and therefore even more bitter tragedy. Lyral, her silver hair once shining like moonlight now spattered with grime and black blood, continued to command, but in her voice, always so melodious, appeared for the first time a hoarseness and crack of despair. Fanner, maddened by rage for his fallen kin, threw himself into the very thick of the goblins, his blade dancing, tearing to shreds all in its path. And it seemed the very grace of his people was embodied in this lethal dance. But rage, blinding and reckless, clouded his mind. He did not notice he had broken from his kin's formation, and a trio of trolls, acting with unexpected coordination, cut off his retreat. Lyral, seeing this, gave a desperate cry, but it was too late. Her brother was swallowed by the grey crowd of enemies, and only a furious, blindingly white surge of magic momentarily illuminated the spot where he had stood. Like a final sigh, before fading into the oppressive dark, Bread's power over stone was the only thing holding back total rout, the last bastion of hope. He could not be everywhere, but his intervention decided the fate of each sector of battle. Now he called forth a stone wall from the earth, shielding retreating wounded. Now he made the ceiling collapse on the heads of fresh goblin detachments emerging from the fortress, and the crash of collapse momentarily drowned all other sounds. But even his strength, ancient and measureless, was not infinite. With each such massive action, his own body, the vessel of ancient essence, was depleted, and in his once impenetrable, polished granite gaze began to show signs of severe strain, deep weariness penetrating to the very soul. It seemed the very mountain shuddered from this fury, from this all-consuming battle. The roar stood so thick and dense it even drowned out death cries, turning them into soundless lip movements. The parade ground before Khazad Gatol had become a single mash of bodies, armor fragments, and dark, sticky blood, in which it was already impossible to discern separate clashes. Only a general seething of all-consuming chaos, where dwarf and goblin merged in one last, desperate effort. Daryl's rangers, those same 15 silent shadows that had marched in the vanguard, had fallen almost by half. Their bodies, always so agile and elusive, now lay scattered on the cold stone, some with slit throats, some with rib cages torn open by a troll's club, some with poisoned darts sticking from their backs. They had fought to the very end, using every fold of terrain, every column, but against blind fury and overwhelming numerical superiority, their refined and precise art proved powerless. On his feet, back to back with a couple of surviving kin, Daryl still held. His face was crisscrossed with small wounds, one arm hung limp, but in the other he clutched a bloodied blade, and his eyes with vertical pupils burned with the cold, ruthless fire of last resistance. He no longer commanded, he simply killed, becoming the last living bastion on his sector. And his blade, swift and inexorable, sever any creature that dared approach this island of doomed valor. And at this very moment, when it seemed the troll that had just scattered the fragile dwarven formation and turned their bodies to bloody dust was about to crash into their weakened flank, something happened that made even this all-consuming madness freeze for an instant. The air thickened, filling with an unearthly tension, and the very mountain, until then nearly an impassive observer of the slaughter, seemed to hold its breath. Bread Stoneheart, who until then had acted with silent, almost ritual precision, as if performing an ancient, inexorable dance, suddenly made a movement full of primordial, almost wild power. He did not merely raise his hand, he seemed to seize the very flesh of the mountain, its stone muscles and veins. With a deafening roar like the wrath of the planet itself, from the ceiling of the great hall, with a crash that shook the bones of all fighters, tore free a colossal boulder, the size of a cliff that had slept in the depths for ages. It did not fall but, as if thrown by the invisible hand of an angered titan, pierced the air and smashed into the chest of the advancing troll. The impact was monstrous, absolute. The bony carapace and powerful, cable-like musculature of the giant offered no barrier. The boulder passed clear through, tearing out gobbets of flesh and rib fragments on exit, and continued its flight, hurling the troll's lifeless body backward. The corpse, flying like a bloody meteor, crashed into the dense crowd of goblins and kobolds, crushing and shattering all in its path, and finally crashed down, burying under itself a dozen small creatures, a bloody pancake of bones and torn scales. For a moment, a shocked, deafening silence reigned, broken only by death rattles and the gut-deep crackle of settling stone. All, friend and foe alike, stared in terror and awe at Brett, feeling an icy stab of fear before a being capable of taming the earth's fury. That this demonstration of power demanded a monstrous, unthinkable price. The dwarf vessel staggered, and from his mouth, streaming with grey dust, gushed a stream of dark, almost black blood smelling of ozone and molten stone. He leaned heavily on his axe, his breathing becoming ragged and hoarse as if gravel were grinding in his chest. The stone skin on his face cracked like dried clay, momentarily revealing the shimmering, blinding energy of the ancient essence, then before sealing again, leaving only a network of fine, smoking scars. This moment of turning point, this fragile moment of universal stupefaction, was caught by Dumrin. His voice, torn to hoarseness, full of unbreakable will, cut through the lull like a blow from a war horn. Forward! For the fallen, for Khazad Gatol, and the bloodied, exhausted but unbroken army surged into battle again, seeing in this act of furious might not merely the destruction of an enemy, but a last chance granted by the mountain itself, a sign that the earth still fought on their side. The battle entered its decisive, most terrible phase. The roar of combat seemed to reach such intensity, it was about to bring down the very vaults of Khazad Gatol, that this was merely the death throes of the enemy army, its last, desperate scream. The destruction of one of the trolls at Brett's hands acted upon the remaining giants, like a whiplash to their dulled consciousness. Their animal, primordial terror before a force surpassing their own momentarily overcame blind rage. The dwarves, sensing this faltering, fell upon them with redoubled force, like hounds upon a wounded boar. The Thunderhammer's unit led by Boring Gorethroat, heedless of monstrous losses, surrounded one giant in a tight ring, while it, roaring in fury, fought off attacks from the front. Several dwarves, like tireless jackhammers, crept up from behind and began methodically, with measured thuds, shattering its tendons with their massive mauls. The troll crashed to its knees with a roar of unbearable pain, and in that moment Boring, with a short, stone-like battle cry, drove his legendary maul straight into its temple. The sound was low and wet, like a burst sack filled with wet gravel. The second troll was bound by the rune wardens of Magni's stonecutter with glowing runic chains, etched directly in the air, and while it struggled helplessly in their tightening embrace, dwarves of the Iron Hand clan hewed its body apart with their razor-sharp halberds, and chunks of grey flesh fell with a crash onto the bloodied stones. Meanwhile, the dwarven clans, united into a single steel fist under Dumrin and Thorbin's command, began methodically, unhurriedly scything down the remaining goblins. This was no longer chaotic fighting, but coordinated, polished butcher's work, a harvest of death. Shields locked with a dull clang, forming an impassable wall from which lethal axe blades flew out with a whistle, unerringly severing limbs and heads. The goblins, bereft of troll support and demoralized by the death of their chieftains, scurried like rats in a trap. Their wild, piercing shrieks now held not malice, but panicked, all-consuming terror. They tried to retreat, back toward the dark passages, but the path into the fortress was utterly choked by heaps of bodies and stone barricades Brett had made at the battle's start. It became a slaughter, systematic extermination. The dwarves, feeling neither pity nor mercy, step by step, inexorably pressed the goblins, gutting bellies, crushing skulls, and trampling the fallen under their heavy, steel-shod boots. The air, already stifling, filled with an unbearable, Swedish nauseating reek of torn entrails and death. The smell of final victory smelling of carrion. In the very heart of this hell, like an ancient, unshakable god of war whose throne was heaps of mangled bodies and scepter-bloodied metal, fought a grim, his figure, mighty and immovable, was the pivot around which all the day's fury revolved. His new hammer, thunder of the deeps, hummed in his blood-slick hands, describing wide, crushing arcs, and each swing left a crimson trail in the air and the smell of ozone. He no longer merely struck, he erased enemies into dust, into bloody mist. Each blow was a deep, hard-won act of retribution for every burned home of Farwater, for the fallen guard whose laugh would no longer sound in the deep halls, for all who had not lived to see this hour and whose souls now demanded payment. Goblins scattered from him like chaff, their flimsy armor and brittle bones unable to withstand the might of tempered dwarven steel. and the fury blazing in his chest with unquenchable fire. He strode forward, paying no heed to arrows lodged in his pauldrons and glancing blows off his helm. His armor was hacked to tatters, turned into a sieve. His face, streaming with sweat and soot, was streaked with scarlet blood from a deep head wound, but he kept moving, like an inexorable force of nature, a landslide that could not be stopped. Beside him, limping but not falling a step behind, fought Mercil de Khazad, leaking sticky, dark blood from a wound in his side. With his curved, claw-like blade soundlessly and efficiently finished off those only stunned by Grimm's crushing hammer blows. They were the core, that inseparable tandem of fury and precision, around which seethed the final, most cruel and desperate part of the butchery. Victory was near, its bitter taste already felt on the lips, but its price grew with each new heartbeat, with each fallen comrade. Amid this general slaughter, on the blood-drenched, bow-littered parade ground, still towered, like ancient menhirs, the last 3 trolls. They stood back to back, forming a living, breathing bastion of fury and pain. Their bodies, gray and bumpy, were studded with dozens of wounds, arrows like porcupine quills, deep axe notches, burned, smoking patches of skin from magical surges. That they did not yield. Their small eyes flared with bestial fire. Each swing of their clubs, cobbled from fragments of dwarven statues and felled siege engines, still brought death, dealing it generously and indiscriminately. One such blow, falling upon the locked shield wall of the Iron Summit clan, sent 3 dwarves into oblivion at once, turning their sturdy armor and fragile bones into homogeneous bloody pulp smeared across the stone. These giants became the last stronghold of all remaining resistance. Around them, like flotsam washed against cliff bases, scurried the last surviving goblins and kobolds, driven now not by thirst for loot, but by blind animal survival instinct, clinging to their giant kin as to a last refuge in this hell. The ground underfoot was terrible, it breathed death. Thousands of bodies, goblins, dwarves, kobolds were mingled in a monstrous, scarlet mash. It was impossible to step without treading on something soft, yielding, and revoltingly slick. A dwarf in magnificent, but now mutilated, and dented armor lay in an eternal, unnatural pose embracing a scrawny goblin, whose bony hands still gripped with dead strength. A rusty dagger stuck in a crevice of the plate. Everywhere, like terrible trinkets, lay severed limbs, bluish intestines spilled onto stone, skulls crushed like ripe fruit. Kobolds, masters of vile attacks from darkness, were now themselves hewn into by dwarven axes or pinned to the ground by accurate elven arrows. This was not merely chaos, it was a finished, horrifying in its meticulous detail portrait of total slaughter, painted by death itself. A grim, his breathing a hoarse, whistling sound in a parched throat, his muscles burning with fire, fixed a gaze full of cold hatred upon one of the trolls. His hammer, thunder of the deeps, was coated in a thick, congealing crust of blood, hair, and brains, but he still gripped its haft with strength capable of bending a steel bar. He understood, so long as these giants stood, so long as their clubs shattered his kin, the battle was not over, and each of their swings took another life, another drop of hope from an already nearly exhausted well. And then a new sound came, not a cry or clash of steel, but a low, rising, earthcore hum emanating from Breadstone heart. He stood, barely on his feet, his body a vessel cracked under an impossible burden, but his will, fused with stone, was still strong. It hovered in the very air. He could not raise another boulder, his strength was at its limit, at the bottom. Instead, he turned to what was under the troll's feet, to the very foundation of this place. The stone slabs of the parade ground, soaked with blood to a crimson hue, suddenly came alive, stirred. They did not heave, but began to float, like thick, viscous tar, enveloping the powerful, tiller-like legs of the giants, clinging to them with sticky stone shackles. The trolls, roaring in fury and surprise, tried to tear free, but the stone, guided by ancient, inexorable force, held them in a steel, tightening grip. It was a chance, the last, hard one, poured from blood and pain chance. And the dwarves, elves, and surviving warriors, gathering their last strength, surged forward to use it, knowing in their hearts that the next moment, the next breath would become the final act of this great and terrible battle. And the trolls, bound by Breadstone fetters, were finished off, their mighty bodies falling under a hail of blows. Their last, piercing roar, full of pain and fury, became the final, deafening chord of this long bloody symphony. And silence fell, not peaceful, but ringing, oppressive. Heavy silence broken only by ragged moans of the wounded and the gut-deep crackle of dying torches. The parade ground before Khazad Gatol presented an apocalyptic, revolting sight. Thousands of bodies of goblins, kobolds, dwarves lay in a monstrous, multi-layered tangle, forming a continuous, twitching in death throes carpet of flesh and clotted blood. The air was thick and heavy, almost unbearable, saturated with the acrid reek of death, torn entrails, and cooling, smoke-smelling steel. Victory, won at such cost, brought no jubilation, evoked no triumphant cries. Standing amidst this boundless sea of death, the survivors felt only a soul-chilling emptiness and all-consuming bitterness of irreplaceable, forever gone losses. A Grim finally lowered his hammer, and it sank into the bloody mire with a dull thud. His titanic figure swayed from exhaustion, and all his smiths and warriors might suddenly left him, leaving only weariness. He looked upon Guard's body, crushed into a shapeless bloody pancake, and was seized by mute, all-consuming grief, sharper than any wound. All his fury, all his vengeance, all this river of spilled enemy blood proved powerless and empty before this final, silent loss. Dumoran Ironhand, having removed his dented, notched helmet, walked slowly across the battlefield, and each of his steps echoed dully in the ringing silence. His gaze, heavy and weary, slid over familiar, forever frozen, in death grimace faces. He saw fallen warriors from all clans Ironhand, Copperbeard, Thunderhammers, their beards, once well-groomed and proud, now matted with blood and dust. Each was not merely a warrior, each was a living part of his people, a torn piece of his own soul. Victory, conquered at such price, turned out bitter and acrid, like the taste of ashes on the tongue. Nearby Lyral knelt beside Halder's body, her once impeccable, moonlight-shining garments turned to bloodied rags. Her slender fingers, trembling, softly closed his eyes, and her shoulders, usually so straight and proud, shook with soundless, soul-deep sobs. The loss of the old sage, keeper of her people's memory and songs, was a blow equal to losing an entire unit, for with him a particle of their shared history had been extinguished. Bread Stoneheart stood motionless by the majestic, but now mutilated, entrance to the fortress. Like an ancient, half-ruined statue, his body, which had been the vessel of incredible, elemental power, now looked fragile and utterly depleted. The deep cracks on his stone skin, like a dried riverbed, had grown deeper, and his gaze, usually full of bottomless knowledge of ages, now expressed only one infinite, all-consuming weariness. The price he had paid for this victory was immeasurable, and it seemed each stone he had overthrown had carried away a particle of his own essence. The siege of Khazad Gatol had been won. The citadel's gates, though shattered, twisted, now belonged to the dwarves again. But there was no jubilation, feast fires in sight. There was only deafening silence, the bitterness of grief, and the heavy, shoulder-pressing burden of memory of those who remained lying in the cold stone of the four-gate parade ground, taying with their hot blood for the return of the ancient stronghold. Dumoran stood over this silent sea of fallen, and the silence around was heavier than any mountain rock he had ever lifted. But when he spoke, his voice, torn and hoarse, did not mourn, it hewed this silence, as a stonecutter's chisel cuts granite, cleaving away all superfluous. Not a time for tears. His words fell into the sepulchral silence like dressed stone blocks, acquiring weight and meaning, while within our walls, in our sacred halls, lingers alien, plague-ridden life. Tears are betrayal. Betrayal of those who laid down in this stone so we might stand. He slowly turned to the survivors, to those whose faces were distorted by weariness and pain, and in his eyes scorched like earth after a landslide reflected distant crimson conflagrations, still blazing in the fortress depths, like unhelling wounds. Their death cries out not for mercy, but for retribution, and we shall drive the slap of fate right down the throat of everyone who dared breathe our air, especially the one who fancied himself master in our ancestral home. The thundercaller in his calloused hand swept upward, and on the clotted, layered blood of the blade flashed crimson, sinister reflections of distant fire. We shall not merely reclaim a pile of stones, we shall carve out, sear away the memory of our disgrace. And we begin with the one who mocked it most. Grizzlix still breathes. Let us cut off his air. He did not walk, he moved, as an avalanche descends, inexorably and crushingly. And behind him, without loud orders, without victory cries, rose those who could still hold weapons, in whom glowed a spark of final fury. These were not victors, these were avengers. Not warriors, instruments of punishment. Their tomb-like silence broken only by the scrape of stone undersoles, was more terrible than any battle cry. They entered the black breach not to reclaim a serene past but to burn it out of the present, with white-hot iron. Each swing of an axe henceforth was not merely a strike but an act of purification, a sacred ritual of vengeance. And somewhere ahead, in the darkest, defiled halls, awaited the one whose death was to put a thick, bloody full stop in this history written in blood on the stone tablets of their ancestral home. The great halls of Khazad Gatol, once shining with unshakable might and artisan skill, appeared before them as a nightmarish, ugly parody of themselves. Colossal vaults, lost in smoking darkness, swallowed not the familiar hum of hammers and ring of metal, but the ominous, drawn-out echo of their own footsteps, returning to them distorted into a whisper. The air, once imbued with the honest smell of hot iron, stone dust, and sweat, was now heavy and stale, poisoned with the reek of rot, dead earth, and acrid chemical smoke that tickled nostrils and caused nausea. They marched along broad streets hewn from rock, where once rang rhythmic hammer strokes on metal and resounded deep voices. Now under their heavy, shod boots crunched scattered bones and slid, in sticky muck of decomposing remains. The sacred forges, the citadel's heart, were looted and defiled. On their great anvils goblins had erected bloody altars, stained brown, and the visages of ancient kings carved upon walls were splattered with filth. Stone sarcophagi holding the ashes of great ancestors had been pried open and ransacked. Bones scattered, and sacred relics and ancient runes lay underfoot in heaps of garbage and ash. Trampled by the conqueror's boots, their advance into the depths of the defiled halls was slow, methodical, and ruthless. Like a glacier's movement grinding rock, dwarven units, guided by Dumrin's implacable and Thorbin's cold calculation, combed every dark nook, every side niche. Combat lost the scale of an open field, turning into a series of short, furious, and incredibly bloody clashes in the stifling confines of halls and low tunnels, where every breath echoed, and the smell of fear mingled with the smell of death. In the Hall of Ancestors, under colossal, soot-blackened vaults, where once no foreigner dared set foot, a small group of goblins, cut off from the main force, had made their last, desperate stronghold. They barricaded themselves behind heaps of bones and shattered stoneware, showering the entering dwarves with a hail of arrows and darts that clattered viciously against stone slabs. The dwarves of the Iron Hand, not slowing their heavy, measured tread, locked shields into a solid steel wall. Arrows bounced off polished steel with a dry, impotent clatter, like hail upon a cliff. Having crossed half the hall under this lethal but futile rain, they fell upon the flimsy barricade. This was no longer a fight but a beating, mechanical and horrifying. Axes and halberds worked with terrifying efficiency, turning goblins into bloody pulp, spraying dark blood and shreds of flesh across walls. Within minutes the hall fell silent again, and the dwarves, without a word, moved on, leaving behind only smoking puddles of blood and mutilated, mangled corpses. In a narrow, damp tunnel leading to ventilation shafts, Thorbin's copper-beared unit encountered a cunning kobold ambush. The reptilian humanoids, blending with the rough wall relief, attacked from pitch darkness, trying to latch onto armor and slit throats. But Thorbin, with his cold, steel-like calculation, had anticipated such a possibility. His warriors did not flinch or panic. They instantly stood back to back, while those in the formation center raised blazing torches. And the blinding light momentarily tore from the darkness the creature's yellow, vertical pupilled eyes. The flaring, sulfur-like eyes became perfect targets for dwarven crossbowmen standing in the second rank. A series of short, crisp clicks, and a dozen kobolds dropped onto the stones with thick bolts protruding from eye sockets. The rest, blinded and crazed, were finished off in brutal close combat, where short but incredibly powerful dwarven axes proved far more effective than fragile claws. The great arched bridges spanning bottomless chasms, where below only an unseen subterranean river whisper, became the site of even more dramatic and swift clashes. Several goblins, desperate and maddened by terror, tried to collapse one of the bridges by hacking at its massive stone supports. But Bread Stoneheart, walking in the center of the host, seemingly lost in thought, did not even glance their way. The stone of the bridge itself, obedient to his will, closed around the vandals' legs, entombing them alive in the rock as if in stone resin. Their desperate, short screams quickly faded, swallowed by the bottomless silence of the chasm. With each cleared hull, each traversed and cleansed tunnel, the dwarves march ever more confidently, their movements gaining long-lost coordination. They did not merely kill, they erased, scrubbed away traces of defilement, toppled ugly goblin idols, cast into black chasms heaped bones of ancestors, washed obscene graffiti from sacred walls with enemy blood. They were returning to their home not only physical control, but also lost dignity, stone by stone. And ahead, in the darkest and deepest bowels of the fortress, in the place that once was the throne hall of the kings of Khazad Gatol, awaited their final, main foe. The one who had started all this nightmare and who was to end it. The few goblins and kobolds still encountered on the way no longer launched furious, suicidal attacks, but only desperately retreated, their eyes full of animal, panicked terror. Darting about seeking salvation, they fled in one direction deeper into the citadel, to its very heart, like cockroaches scurrying to their crack. When Dumrin's unit, fighting through a last narrow corridor, burst into the former throne hall of the kings of Khazad Gatol, they were met only by ominous, mocking echoes of their own footsteps. The colossal chamber, one shining with unshakable grandeur and architect's skill, was mutilated beyond recognition, turned into a giant dump. Heaps of garbage, scraps of leather, bleached bones, and trophy weapons lay everywhere, filling the space with the stench of decay. In the center of the hall, on a dais, stood Grizzly's very throne, an ugly, blasphemous pile of fragments of dwarven statues once depicting great rulers and heroes. Upon it still lay a dirty cushion reeking of sweat and smoke, but the master of this den, this shameful heap, was not upon it. The air in the hall was fresher, colder than in other parts of the fortress. A fresh, piercing stream of mountain wind poured from the north, bringing the smell of snow and freedom. Dumrin approached the north wall of the hall with heavy, ringing steps. There, where reserve gates leading to the spurs of the dragon's spine should have been, now gaped emptiness, a black maw into the night. The massive stone leaves, though inferior to the main gates, had been breached from within, their mighty bolts sawn through. On the ground by the opening, like traces of panic, lay discarded shields, broken weapons, and other junk, clear signs of hasty, shameful flight. The rat has slipped away, Thorben Copperbeard rasped, without a trace of surprise, examining the mangled lock mechanism, gnawed his way out, and took with him those who could still hold weapons. Dumrin was silent, standing on the edge of emptiness, gripping the thunder colors half so hard his fingers whitened and joints cracked. His fury, long accumulated, hard-won and directed at the final, decisive clash, found no outlet, stagnating in his chest as a heavy, soul-poisoning lump. He clearly saw in his mind's eye this picture: Grizzly crooked heart, his squat, limping figure, hastily fleeing through this breach in the rock, leading the remnants of his shattered host into the cold, starless night of the northern wastes. They had retaken the citadel, they had cleansed it of defilement, stone by stone. But the main culprit, the architect of all this nightmare, whose death was to be the full stop, was escaping, leaving behind a trail of hatred and unfinished business. He slowly turned to his warriors, and the weight of this gesture was more palpable than any words. On their weary, soot-stained faces, crisscrossed with fresh scars and spatters of alien blood, was read the same mixture of exhausted relief and bitter, soul-gnawing bitterness. Emptiness, where victory should have been. The fortress is ours, Dumrin thundered, and his voice, hoarse from smoke and shouting, echoed low through the empty, defiled throne hall like hammer blows on an anvil. But the war is not over. He fled. The vile vermin slipped away. But where? Into the void. No, this rat will run to seek new allies, plot new schemes in dark corners. He will seek refuge and patronage from one whose shadow is longer and blacker than his own. He meant the Iron Shaman. Every warrior understood this. Without words, this knowledge hovered in the air, cold, dead, inexorable. We have reclaimed our home, the home of our forefathers. Now we shall make it impregnable. We shall restore every wall, every statue, every chipped stone. We shall return the ashes of ancestors to their sarcophagi, and let their bones find rest. Dumrin paused, and his gaze, sweeping the warriors, grew heavy as molten lead. And then we shall find this rat, and wherever he hides in the deepest, foulest caves, or under the wing of a new master, we shall drag him out by his crooked, lousy neck. Retribution is merely delayed. It has become our duty, a debt of honor. And dwarves, his voice thundered with new strength, dwarves always repay their debts in full. He turned and stared north, into the black, gaping breach, at the dim light filtering from the tunnels leading out of the fortress into cold unknown, where his enemy had fled. The battle for Khazad Gatol was won, that the Great War, the war for their very future, was only just beginning, and its first breath already wafted from that darkness. The throne hall of Khazad Gatol slowly, like blood seeping from a wound, filled with survivors, following the dwarven elders, whose armor still rattled with fragments of past battles. Entered here those whose blood had mingled with dwarven blood. On the death-drenched outer parade ground, a grim, his titanic, mighty figure seeming even more massive than eternal in this scarred and soot-stained magnificence, stood gripping his hammer's haft. Beside him, leaning on a rough wooden crutch, stood Mercil, and his golden slit eyes, devoid of any warmth, reflected coldly in the light-absorbing gloom. Lyriel's elves, their once impeccable, shining garments turned to bloodied rags, formed a silent, mournful group, their beautiful faces pale and detached as if carved from marble. The Centaurs, their mighty, powerful flanks heaving heavily after battle, stood behind. And Daryl's rangers, only 6 remained, frozen deep shadow by the entrance, like faithful, silent shadows, almost indistinguishable from the stone. The air in the hall was thick and heavy, saturated not with smoke and reek, but with silent, all-encompassing grief. Each, from dwarf to elf, saw before them the unreturned faces. Gard, Tarlin, Simul, Halder, the fallen Centaurs. Thousands of dwarves whose names would now be carved on memorial steles. Their memory hovered under the blackened vaults, pressing upon the shoulders of the living, heavier than any stone. And in this oppressive, ringing silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the wounded, Dumrin Ironhand raised his head. His voice, stripped of its former shattering fury, sounded dully and weightily, like a funeral knell for an entire era. The Empire's betrayal in the days of the Old Alliance. He slowly swept his gaze over the assembled, and in his eyes was read not old, hardened resentment, but a bitter, hard-won understanding of shared fate, was paid today, with interest, with our shared blood, spilled here, on this stone. No one owes anyone anything more. The debt is settled, accounts closed. He paused, letting these words, these leaden weights, penetrate every heart, every soul standing in the hall. Then his voice acquired a new, ancient, ritual power, the very kind that once bound ancient oaths and laid the foundations of mountain kingdoms. Hearken to me, children of Valoria. Hearken to the voice of blood that flowed here as a river and soaked into these walls, never to be forgotten. Before the eyes of the fallen ancestors of Khazad Gatol, we, the survivors, whose hearts are gutted by grief and souls seared by battle's fire, make this oath, not on parchment, for it will rot, not on stone, for it will crack, but upon our hearts, which shall beat remembering this hour, and in the hearts of our children, and our children's children, until our line is extinguished in the ages. He turned to a grim, to his titanic, blood and sweat-drenched figure, the sole representative of men whose fury had matched the dwarves. We swear by the blood of the fallen guard, he thundered, and the comrades' mane hung in the air like an unhelling wand. His gaze, heavy and piercing, slid over the slender, exhausted figures of Lyriel's elves. Over their pale, detached faces, we swear by the blood of all fallen children of the forest. Tarlin, Simul, Halder, Fanner. Each sound fell like a stone into the bottomless well of their shared loss, reminding of every extinguished gaze, every voice cut short. He struck his chest with a gauntleted, scarred fist, and the dull thud echoed in the sepulchral silence. We swear by the blood and fury of all sons and daughters of the mountain, who fell today with axe in hand, yielding not an inch, who laid down their bones upon this stone. Dumrin's voice thundered, filling the vast hall, soaking into the very stones, the very flesh of the mountain, becoming part of it. Henceforth and forever there are no men, elves, or dwarves among us. There is but one people, the people of Valoria, bound by shared blood spilled here, and shared fate we forged today. He raised the thunder collar, and the axe blade flashed in the dim light. In answer, weapons were raised by dozens of hands, callous dwarven hands gripping axe hafts. A Grimm's mighty hand raising thunder of the deeps, the elegant hands of elves with slender but lethal blades, the mighty spears of centaurs aimed at the blackened vaults. We swear that never again shall our blade be drawn against a brother. Our enmity, our fury shall be turned only upon the outer darkness that dares encroach upon our common home, our common hearth. We swear to share bread in hour of hunger, knowledge in hour of ignorance, strength in hour of weakness. Let the hands that mere hours ago held sword and axe together take up plough and hammer, to rebuild what we nearly lost forever. We swear to keep this memory, this one upon our shared soul, the memory of the price. The unimaginable price we paid for the right simply to breathe this air and walk this earth. And woe to him, be he elf, dwarf, or man, who forgets this price and dares trample this oath for old hatred or new greed. May he be an outcast to the living and a curse to the dead who lie here. Gazing upon us with empty sockets, he lowered the axe, quoting the ancient oath almost verbatim, and in the ensuing silence, thick and heavy, his final words sounded as both verdict and vow simultaneously, stamped into eternity. And so be it, that while our hearts beat, so long as these walls stand, even if they be rebuilt anew from these very stones, we are one. The echo of the last word, mighty and drawn out, rolled under the colossal vaults and slowly faded, soaking into the stone. And in this new silence, there was no longer the former oppressive grief. There was resolve, heavy as mountain rock, hard-won and inexorable, and unbreakable as battle-tempered steel. The oath was given, not by rulers and kings observing battle from afar, but by those who had survived, who stood knee-deep in blood and ash, and each understood in their heart's depth henceforth all would be different. The echo of the great oath still hovered under the blackened vaults, mingling with the smell of smoke and blood, when forward, breaking the ranks order, stepped slowly and majestically Bread Stoneheart. His movement was unnaturally fluid, as if a stone had shifted of its own accord, obeying another mighty will. The deep cracks on his face, like dried riverbeds, pulsed with a dull, deathly light, and his voice, when he spoke, sounded like a distant subterranean rumble, in which was heard not only ancient power, but an abyss of weariness and urgency. Words are sealed with blood, and the stone remembers them, he uttered, and his bottomless, mountain-deep gaze slowly swept the assembled, lingering on each face. That the time you bought today with all this spilled blood is already running out. The sand slips through your fingers. All in the hall froze, fixing their gazes upon him. The exalted surge of unity that had mere moments ago uplifted souls collided with the harsh, stone reality embodied by Bread. The chieftain in the east does not slumber, Bread continued, and each of his words fell into the ringing silence like a rock fragment into a bottomless well. Even as we speak, his will, black and ruthless, gathers in the east. The army that will come after this horde will not be a rabble of thieves and trolls. It will be a honed instrument of complete and irrevocable oblivion, and it will come faster than your wounds can heal and new stones grow upon these walls. He slowly raised his hand, and his finger, like a time-worn stalactite, pointed first north, in the direction where Grizzlick had slipped away, then turned and pointed east, from where they all expected the main, true threat, the very one that made stones groan in foreboding. This fortress is but a torn fang. Bread's voice sounded with stone indifference, bloodied and painful to the beast, but its maw is still full of lethal venom. You have reclaimed your heart, wrested it back at the cost of incredible losses. But now is the hour to save the whole body, before the blight seeps into its very veins. Dumran, frowning his thick, scarred brows, nodded silently. All his plans of immediate restoration of halls, of returning Khazad Gatol's former grandeur crumbled to dust before the inexorable logic of the ancient being who saw farther and deeper than any mortal. What then is to be done? He asked hoarsely, almost as an exhale, and in his voice was heard the heavy burden of decision. Leave a garrison here, Bread answered, and his words were clear and indisputable as laws of nature. The hardiest, most enduring. Let them hold these gates and begin the slow, methodical cleansing of defilement. That the main forces all of you. His bottomless gaze slid slowly over Dumran, Thorben, Lyral, Agrim. Must return to Naruz Damarak. Heal wounds, lick them in the depths of safe halls, gather strength, forge new weapons. Prepare. The true battle is yet ahead, and it will decide the fate not of a single fortress, but of your entire fragile world, all that you know. He fell silent, and his silence, thick and weighty, was more eloquent than any loud orders. The realization of a new, far more terrible reality slowly but surely settled in the minds of the assembled, penetrating to the very heart. The fleeting exultation of victory gave way to a heavy, cold, but crystal-clear understanding of a long and merciless war. They had reclaimed their past, won back their right to remember. Now they had to defend the very future, give it a chance to rive, and they had no time at all for hesitation, for respite. The decision hung in the air heavy, joyless, bitter as smoke after a fire, but the only correct one in its ruthless pragmatism. The sense of temporary, fragile victory gave way to cold, calculated strategic necessity. Dumran's face, a moment ago illuminated by the fire of the great oath, again became like a stern bas-relief carved from the hardest granite. The northern tunnels, his voice sounded curtly, without former solemnity, returning all to cruel specifics. They must be sealed, for good, so that not a single creature, not a single scout, seeps back into our rear while all our gaze is turned east. Thorben Copperbeard, not waiting for further instructions, was already making notes on his grease-stained, diagram-covered blueprint. His practical, engineering mind, detaching from lofty matters, was already working on a purely technical solution. Explosives, he threw in shortly and clearly, not looking up from the parchment. Charge the supporting arches at the narrowest points. Not just collapse the entrance, but bring the mountain down on the approaches. For a long time, for ages, it was the final and irrevocable sentence for the northern exit, to turn it into an impassable, tightly choked stone tomb, burying under tons of rock the very memory of the path by which Grizzlick had slipped away. The garrison here will have nothing to catch but dust and ghosts, someone from among the gray-bearded elders remarked gloomily, pensively, looking at the soot-blackened walls, and that is immeasurably better than catching a poisoned dagger in the back. Dumrin parried immediately, and in his voice again sounded the steely wool. He swept his gaze over the assembled dwarves, men, elves. Seeing in their eyes the same stern understanding, we returned to Naruz Damarak. Not empty-handed, but with victory paid for in blood, but not with a triumphal march, but with tidings of a new, great war. A war that forgives neither weakness nor error. He thought at that moment of the countless halls of the great dwarven stronghold, of the thousands upon thousands of warriors who would have to stand under banners, of the feverish work of forges, of alliances that would have to be sealed now not with oaths but with a common, world-overhanging threat. There, in the deep halls of Naruz Damarak, we shall gather such an army. Dumrin's voice again acquired that very steely, unshakable firmness that had led them into battle, before which any horde the East can send against us will pale. An army not of one race, but of all who hold this world dear, who have something to lose. We showed today, we can stand shoulder to shoulder in hour of mortal danger. Now we shall prove to all the world that standing together, we can also win. And while the dwarves were already businesslike discussing the collapse of the northern tunnels, the main part of the weary but unbroken army was already turning, ready for the long and perilous journey home. Not home to a quiet hearth and peace, but home to prepare for a new, even more terrible war. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.